Chapter 6. Fire. For the firefighters at the Specialized Military Fire Department No. 2 on April the 25th, it was a day like any other, except that it was Friday. Everyone was discussing plans for the coming weekend. Many were getting ready to visit their families in neighboring towns and villages, where they would help with sowing potatoes. Those living in Chernobyl had private plots beside their cottages. Potatoes were on everyone's mind. Most of the engineers and technical personnel working at the power plant were newcomers from Russia and other parts of Ukraine, but the firefighters, like the construction workers, were locals, Ukrainians and Belarusians from across the border. These village boys had taken jobs and salaries that they could only have dreamed of in their rural birthplaces. The shift lasted 24 hours, from 8 a.m. one morning to 8 a.m. the next, including the extra half hour for their shift change with the next group of firefighters. They were supposed to be free to go home no later than 8:30 a.m. on April the 26th. They would have 48 hours off, with another shift starting on Monday, April the 28th. They had spent the day studying, exercising, and training around Unit 5, which was still under construction, but in the evening they had taken it easy. Some of the men had taken naps, while others had watched television. The evening news came on at 9 p.m. The main news item was the recent Politburo meeting at which Gorbachev and the party leadership had discussed ways of increasing production of consumer goods, an all-important issue in a society that suffered shortages of basic consumer items. Cars, an especially coveted item, could be bought only after spending years on the waiting list. Some of the older firefighters were driving cars, but the younger ones had motorcycles. In the international news, the hot topic was the conflict between the United States and Libya. President Ronald Reagan had ordered airstrikes on Libya on April the 15th, in response to the bombing 10 days earlier of the La Belle discotheque in West Berlin, which was frequented by American military personnel. The move was highly controversial, not only in the Soviet Union but also in the West, and Soviet television had a field day covering protests against the American action throughout the world. On Friday night, people waited impatiently for the end of the news and the start of entertainment shows. At 11:10 p.m., one of the two all-union television programs broadcast a popular contest, Song 86. The second all-union program was a report on a gymnastics competition, another favorite of Soviet viewers and a source of pride throughout the country. That year, the star of the competition was Yelena Shushunova. 2 years later, she would win gold at the Summer Olympics in Seoul, the first Olympics since 1976 in which Soviet and American athletes took part together. The Americans had boycotted the Moscow Olympics in 1980 after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and the Soviets retaliated by refusing to attend the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. As others watched television, chatted or napped, the officer in charge of the firefighters, a 23-year-old lieutenant named Volodymyr Pravik, was sitting in his office writing. Some thought he was working on his study notes, as he was planning to continue his education and enter a firefighter school for senior officers. But Pravik was also in the habit of writing letters to his wife, Nadika, because they had lived apart for a year. Volodymyr was in Chernobyl, while Nadika was finishing her studies in Cherkasy, a city on the Dnieper 320 kilometers south of Pripyat. They had met there when Volodymyr was studying at the Firefighters Academy, and she was a student in the local music school. They fell in love instantly, but Nadika was only 17, too young to marry. Volodymyr returned to his hometown of Chernobyl, while she remained in Cherkasy. They married in 1984. In the following year, Nadika moved to Pripyat, but Volodymyr was still more comfortable expressing his deepest feelings for her in writing. He used his long shifts away from his family to write her letters. 2 weeks earlier, Nadika had given birth to their daughter Natalka. Lieutenant Pravik asked his superiors to move him to a different position, without night shifts, so he could spend more time with his family. They promised to arrange the move, but there was no one to replace him yet, so he had to stay for the time being. He loved his job and his crew, and he was always working on projects to improve things in the fire department. With the help of one of the firefighters, he designed and installed remote-control doors in the department's garage, a rare feature at the time. That day he had brought his tape recorder to work, with the idea of preparing a musical greeting to his crew for the coming holidays. At 2 a.m. he was supposed to be replaced on duty and take a nap before the end of the shift at 8 a.m. Later that morning, he, Nadika, and their daughter were planning to visit his parents in Chernobyl. Like everyone else in his unit, he was preparing to help his parents with the gardening. Lieutenant Pravik and his crew were by no means the darlings of the fire department command. If anything, they were a high-maintenance unit that demanded considerable attention from the department's commander, the 35-year-old Major Leonid Telyatnikov. It was a highly distinctive unit. You could say that it was a unit of individuals, Telyatnikov recalled, because everyone was on his own. There were a great many veterans there, a great many mavericks. Pravik was the youngest of them. Every subordinate of his was older than he was. The firefighters were paid quite well, and it was not easy to get a job in the department. Many had gotten theirs through family connections. Fathers, sons, and brothers formed networks that were hard to penetrate, even for a seasoned commander. Pravik believed in leading by example. Telyatnikov wanted him to be tougher with his men, who took advantage of him and occasionally let him down. Pravik brought their requests for better living conditions, days off, and so on, directly to Telyatnikov. On one occasion, he publicly opposed his commander on the issue of punishing a subordinate who had missed his shift. The firefighter had confused the dates when he was supposed to be on duty. Pravik believed that he should not be punished too harshly. Telyatnikov disagreed and had numerous discussions with Pravik about it. He even spoke with his wife, who he believed had influence over her husband, but to no avail. Pravik continued to put his people first. It cost him delayed vacations and deferred promotion to the next rank, but the rough veterans loved their young commander. "Pravik was a very good guy," said one of the men, the 35-year-old Leonid Shavre, in describing his commanding officer. Brainy and competent, he was very knowledgeable about radio engineering, which he loved very much. He was something of a master with light shows or repairing receivers or tape recorders, and he got along well with the men. A fine commander. He could settle any question. If you approached him, he would see to it promptly. Shavre was the oldest of 3 brothers, all of them firefighters from a Belarusian village on the border with Ukraine. The city of Pripyat was only 17 kilometers away from the village, while the administrative center of their country in Belarus was 50 kilometers away. Leonid and Ivan Shavre were both members of Pravik's crew, and both were on duty that night. Their youngest brother, Petr, a lieutenant, was at home. After watching television, Leonid went to take a nap. He was supposed to replace Pravik, who was still on watch at 2 a.m. Ivan was in front of the fire station, chatting with other firefighters, when they heard a sound. Ivan recognized it immediately as a release of steam from the power station. That had happened before, so he did not pay much attention to it. Ivan had just walked into the fire department building when he heard an explosion, then another one. What had happened? He rushed to the window and saw a fireball rising above Unit 4. The siren sounded, waking up Leonid. "Look, it's burning," came the voices of his fellow firefighters, pointing to the power station. Above the station, usually illuminated at night by numerous spotlights, a mushroom cloud of smoke was rising from the top of the reactor building, a red column turning blue as it ascended and exploded into a black cloud. Before they knew it, they were already in the fire truck, Leonid Shavre sitting next to Lieutenant Pravik, Ivan Shavre following in the next truck. 3 trucks were speeding toward the power plant. As they approached the gates, they could see nothing of the fire and smoke they had just observed. They reached the administration building, located at some distance between Units 1 and 2. Behind the units and connecting them was a turbine hall, a long structure approximately 32 meters in height that connected all 4 reactors of the power plant. Units 3 and 4 were next to each other and shared a tall exhaust pipe that would end up in almost all the photos of the Chernobyl plant. The height of the units and the level at which the pipe began was 72 meters, the height of a 17-story building, comparable to a medium-sized American skyscraper of the 1920s and 1930s. As they looked in the direction of the pipe, they were stunned by the scope of the disaster. The roof of Unit 4 was gone, as was a good part of the wall. Tongues of flame were licking the remaining walls. The shocked Pravik radioed alarm signal number 3, the highest level of alert, which meant that all firefighting units in the entire Kiev region were immediately called into action. Pravik was acting as he always did, taking responsibility. "Well, Mikhailovich, it's going to be hot for us," said Pravik, addressing Leonid Shavre respectfully by his patronymic. "We'll really have to work here." Shavre understood immediately that the situation was grim. "My hair stood on end," he remembered later. The time was 1:28 a.m., 5 minutes after the explosion. Pravik and his crew left the truck and ran along the transport corridor through Unit 3, trying to figure out what had happened. They found a telephone in the corridor, but no one responded to their call. Finally, they noticed 2 distressed technicians running towards them from Unit 4. "What happened? Where's the fire?" asked the firemen. The technicians were not sure, but suggested that the roof of the turbine hall might be on fire. That was bad news, Pravik realized. There were many combustible items, including extremely valuable equipment, in the turbine hall that connected all 4 units of the power plant, and the fire could spread to all of them. Pravik had to act, and act fast. He ordered Leonid Shavre to get back to his fire truck and drive it up to the wall of the turbine hall. Pravik himself would stay inside the building, try to find out more about the accident, and devise a plan for further action. Shavre did as he was told. Together with another firefighter, Volodymyr Prishchepa, he then climbed onto the roof of the turbine hall. No easy task, as they were wearing full gear and had to climb the ladder, which was 12 meters long and moving as they ascended it. What they saw at the top was much more than a fire. "When I made my way onto the roof, I saw that parts of the ceiling were damaged and some had fallen," recalled Prishchepa a few days later. "Closer to the edge of the roof on Unit 4, I saw the spot where the ceiling had started to burn," he continued. "I wanted to approach it to put out the fire, but the ceiling was shaking. I returned and walked along the wall, following the pipe that supplied water for fighting fires, approached the heart of the fire, and covered it with sand stored on the roof, as it was impossible to attach a hose." Leonid Shavre also remembered that they extinguished the fire without using water. "We tried to beat out the flames with canvas fire hoses. There were water pipes for fighting fires on the roof and hoses in containers, so we used those hoses to fight the fire. There were holes in the roof, and once we started pouring water, there might be short circuits. We beat the flames with the hoses and stamped on them with our feet." Contrary to all safety regulations, the roof on which the firefighters were working was covered with bitumen, a highly inflammable petroleum product. "It was hard to walk as the bitumen on the roof had melted," recalled Shavre. "Such heat. With the slightest increase of temperature, the bitumen immediately caught fire. If you stepped on it, you couldn't put one foot in front of the other. It tore off your boots. And the whole roof was littered with luminous, silvery pieces of debris of some kind. We kicked them aside. One moment they just seemed to lie there, the next moment they would catch fire." What Shavre and Prishchepa were kicking aside were pieces of graphite and radioactive fuel. These radioactive materials were irradiating everything around them, first and foremost the crew members, who had no instruments to measure the radiation or proper gear to protect themselves against it. They were trained to extinguish everyday fires and enter rooms and buildings full of smoke. No one had ever explained to them how to deal with radiation, even though their fire station was near the power plant. They had little, if any, understanding of how the fire they were fighting was different from regular fires, and that it might be radioactive. With the temperature rising, Chevret and Prishchepa removed parts of the regular gear they were wearing. The temperature was high, making breathing difficult. We unbuttoned our gear, took off our helmets, and laid them down, recalled Chevret. Unbeknownst to them, they were being applauded by observers on the ground. The fishermen on the nearby pond who had witnessed the scene were impressed. "He's taken his helmet off," exclaimed one of them. "Fantastic! He is a real hero." In Pripyat, Ludmila Inatenko, the wife of Vasil Inatenko, a crew member of Fire Department No. 6, which was responsible for the fire safety of the city, woke up when she heard a noise under her windows. Like some other young firefighters and their families, Vasil and Ludmila lived in an apartment above the department's garage. Vasil was on duty that night, and she looked out of the window, searching for him. He was there, getting into his truck. "Close the window and go back to sleep," Vasil called out to his wife. "There is a fire at the reactor. I'll be back soon." Ludmila looked towards the power plant and saw flames above Unit 4. Everything was radiant, she remembered, the whole sky, a tall flame, and smoke. The trucks pulled out of the garage and sped off toward the power plant. In charge was Vasil's commander, a 23-year-old lieutenant named Viktor Kibenok. Trained at the Cherkasy Firefighters Academy, he had graduated in 1984, a year after Pravik. Kibenok was in charge of an exemplary unit. All his subordinates were more or less of his age, and he was friends with many of them, including Vasil Inatenko. Inatenko, a prize-winning athlete who had won the title of Master of Sports of the Soviet Union, was 2 years older than Kibenok. Their families spent holidays together, and their wives were friends. The two men worked on the same shift and were now on their way to the nuclear plant. Lieutenant Kibenok reached the plant at 1:45 a.m., 7 minutes after the arrival of Pravik's unit. Since Pravik and his people were dealing with the fire on the roof of the turbine hall, the roof of the reactor hall of Unit 3 became the new priority. It had caught fire from the explosion on the nearby Unit 4. Building the two units next to each other had saved money. They shared an exhaust pipe and other facilities, but now their proximity had turned dangerous. Kibenok, Inatenko, and most of their fellow crew members connected fire hoses to hydrants and to pipes on the walls of the reactor building. They then climbed the ladders attached to the building up to the roof. It was a dangerous task as they were dressed in full gear and the height of the unit was close to 72 meters. From the roof of Unit 3 they could see the terrifying sight of the exploded reactor hall and the fire emerging from below. They located the hoses stored on the roof, connected them to the wall pipes, and began to extinguish the fire. Lieutenant Pravik soon joined Kibenok and his crew on the roof of the reactor hall. His men, including Leonid Chevret, were keeping the roof of the turbine hall under control. Pravik could now help Kibenok. Those remaining on the ground saw Pravik climbing the fire ladder up to the machine hall, and from there to the top of the reactor hall of Unit 3. The location around the base of the exhaust pipe became their battleground. Some of the firefighters, including Inatenko, were using hoses. Others were busy kicking graphite blocks off the roof. They had no idea that the blocks came from the reactor and were killing everything around them by irradiation. Their primary concern was to contain new fires that were being ignited by extremely hot pieces of graphite on the roof. Major Leonid Telyatnikov, the head of Fire Department No. 2 and Pravik's commanding officer, was fast asleep when the telephone rang in his Pripyat apartment. The officer on duty told him that there was a fire at the nuclear plant. Telyatnikov was on vacation, but that did not matter now. He had to join his men at the plant. With all the fire trucks gone, he called the local police and asked them to send him a car. They obliged, and he reached the plant at 1:45 a.m., around the same time as Kibenok's unit. He saw the ruined Unit 4 and the fire spreading on the roof of Unit 3. The tongues of flame there were up to 2 meters high. What else was on fire? He spent his first minutes at the plant, as Pravik had done, running around and assessing the situation. Near the walls of the turbine hall, he ran into Leonid Chavre from Pravik's crew, who had climbed down from the roof to get a fire hose. "Leonid Petrovich, the power cables are broken here. They could have killed me," Chavre told his boss, referring to the destroyed power lines and electric wires hanging from what remained of the walls of Unit 4, from which Telyatnikov was coming. "Well, they didn't kill you, so you're alive," responded Telyatnikov, who asked Chavre where Pravik was. Telyatnikov was concerned about the young lieutenant, but Chavre's reply was encouraging. When the accident happened, regardless of any friction in the crew, regardless of anything, the whole crew followed Pravik without hesitation, recalled Telyatnikov, and no one flinched. Telyatnikov finally saw Pravik when the lieutenant and the group of firefighters from Kibenok's crew climbed down from the roof of the reactor hall of Unit 3. Pravik reported that the fire on the roof had been largely extinguished, but he was clearly in a bad way. There were 7 men with him, all in bad shape and feeling sick, recalled Telyatnikov. He spotted an ambulance nearby and ordered Pravik and his men into it. It was 2:25 a.m. They had spent less than half an hour on the roof, but were now feeling very sick. Everyone now realized that it was not just the effect of the fire. As Pravik got into the ambulance, he asked those around him to tell his wife, Nadika, to close the windows in their apartment. The ambulance sped off to the Pripyat hospital. Ivan Chavre, who was then on the roof of the turbine hall, saw the firefighters from Kibenok's crew starting to climb down as well. They all felt sick. Vasil Inatenko, who was lying on the edge of the roof, was in particularly bad shape. Kibenok, his shirt torn, was moving slowly, holding on to the wall. They were helped down to the ground, and the ambulance took them to the hospital. The only doctor on duty in Pripyat that night was 28-year-old Valentin Belokon, who had been responding to emergency calls, sick children, patients with chronic diseases needing help, and a man who had jumped out of a window after drinking too much. Then came the call from the nuclear station. Belokon arrived at the power plant with painkillers expecting to treat burns, but there were none. He ran into Kibenok before the latter joined his men on the roof of Unit 3. "Is there anyone with burns?" asked Belokon. Kibenok responded, "No, there isn't, but the situation is not quite clear. Something is making my boys feel a bit sick." Belokon recalled that the lieutenant was somewhat agitated, worked up. After Belokon had spoken with Kibenok, firefighters brought him a young workman, approximately 18 years old, who had been working at Unit 3 and had walked into Unit 4 from there. Now he complained of an excruciating headache and nausea. Belokon asked what he had been eating and drinking. It was a Friday night, and his first suspicion was alcohol poisoning. The boy told him that he was sober. Meanwhile, his condition worsened. His speech was slurred, and he grew pale, repeatedly saying, "Horrors, horror." Still, there was no smell of alcohol coming from his mouth. Belokon administered 2 relaxants, relanium, known in the West as diazepam, and aminazin, whose generic name is promazine. More people were soon brought to Belokon, all operators from the plant and all complaining of headaches, dry throat and nausea. Belokon applied the same treatment and sent them to the hospital in an ambulance. Then came the firefighters, who were in even worse condition. It was only when Belokon sent the firefighters to the hospital that he realized what was happening. He called his superiors and asked for potassium iodide, a drug that protected the thyroid from radiation. They were skeptical at first until they saw the first patient sent by Belokon, and then they sent the drug. There was no longer any doubt that they were dealing with radioactive poisoning, but no one knew how high the level of radioactivity was. Belokon started to recall what he had learned about radiation in medical school, Not much. But even the operators at the power plant were oblivious to the danger. The people being brought to Belokon were vomiting, but they refused to admit what was going on, attributing their condition to shock. Ashamed to be seen vomiting, they went outside the building when they felt sick, so that other workers would not see them. Major Telyatnikov was running out of time. He sent reinforcements to the roof of reactor number 3. By 3:30 a.m., he too was experiencing the symptoms he had seen in the firefighters he had sent to the hospital only an hour earlier, nausea and retching. It was his turn to be taken to the hospital. By now the Chavray brothers, Leonid and Ivan, who were both at the power plant fighting the fire, had been joined by their younger brother, Petr. Leonid was on the turbine hall, and Ivan had been sent to the top of reactor number 3 with those who were replacing the Pravik and Kibenok crews. Petr had arrived with another off-duty officer to help deal with the fire. He was not even wearing his gear when, approaching the turbine hall, he heard the voice of his brother Leonid, who was shouting, "Give me hoses! There are no hoses!" The hoses he was using had been burned by the melting bitumen. I immediately took off my shoes and put on kersey boots, throwing my cap into the car, recalled Petr. I put 2 hoses under my arms and climbed the ladder to the top, and that was all the protective gear I had, just my boots. Protection didn't matter. Minutes counted to stop the flames from spreading. The new hoses were finally on the roof of the turbine hall, but there was no water. With the electricity gone, the plumbing system that was supposed to supply water to the pumps was dead. Petr Chavray made a decision on the spot, to use water from the cooling pond nearby. It was easier said than done. Around him was a scene from the apocalypse. The concrete blocks, window glass, graphite, and fragments of fuel rods, all thrown up by the blast, created a hellish obstacle course for the trucks that had to get to the pond. I ran in front of the truck. There was no lighting. Everything was covered with debris, remembered Petr. I dodged like a rabbit with the truck following me, and still the wheels were punctured. I took metal rods out of the wheels with my hands and kicked them out with my feet. Then the skin peeled off my hands. The metal rods were radioactive. Eventually they managed to reach the pond. Water was delivered to the roof of the turbine hall, and the fire was again brought under control. It was only closer to 7 a.m., when the fire was finally extinguished, that the Chavray brothers were allowed to leave their positions around the damaged reactor. Ivan, who had been fighting the fire on the top of reactor number 3, was taken away by an ambulance. He had a sweet taste in his mouth and could barely stand up. Leonid climbed down from the roof of the turbine hall on his own, but he was vomiting. Petr, who had arrived last, already did not feel well. I was retching and felt terribly weak. My legs wouldn't respond, as if they were made of cotton, he remembered. What he wanted most was a drink. He reached for a water hose and drank from it, experiencing immediate relief. "What are you doing? It's dirty," said a fellow crew member, referring to the water brought from the cooling pond. Petr responded that the water looked clean. But the water was radioactive. I knew that, but it seemed to me that if I didn't get a couple of swallows I would fall and wouldn't be able to get up, Petr recalled. He would pay dearly for those 2 sips of water from the Chernobyl pond. His digestive tract was severely damaged. Another young firefighter officer, Petr Khmel, had arrived at the plant at the same time as Petr. Like him, Khmel had relatives already fighting the fire. His father, Hrihory, a truck driver for the Chernobyl City Fire Department, had been among the first to reach the plant after the number 3 alarm radioed by Pravik had sounded. Petr Khmel was an officer of Fire Department number 2 and was supposed to replace Pravik and his crew on duty at 8 a.m. The first thing he learned on arrival was that Pravik had already been taken to the hospital. I went up to the roof of the machine hall to reconnoitre. The roof was completely destroyed, and there were flames, true, not high ones. They gave me a fire hose. After a while I was the only one left there. I asked on the portable radio what to do. They answered, "Wait for your replacement." He stayed. He was not sure how long he remained there. In his haste to reach the plant, he had left his watch at home. But he would later learn the terrible truth that every second counted. While Petro Chmel was on the roof, his father, Hrihori, spent most of the night near the walls of the turbine hall. He saw Pravik climb the fire ladder, learning subsequently that not only Pravik but also Telyatnikov had been taken to the hospital, and began to worry about his son. He had no doubt that Petro would be called as well. Around 7 a.m., when Hrihori and his fellow firefighters were ordered to leave their positions, and potassium iodide was administered to them, he began asking people whether they had seen Petro. The answer was no. Then someone said, "Petro Chmel was taken there as a substitute." Hrihori's heart sank. "There" meant the damaged reactor. "I thought it was all over, finished," he recalled later. Hrihori was told to surrender all his clothing and take a shower. Only after that did he see his son. "I went out onto the street, looked around. It was light and everything was visible, and saw my Petro coming in uniform with a coat on, a fire belt, a cap and leather boots." "Are you here, father?" Petro asked his dad before being taken away for decontamination. Hrihori must have felt like Nikolai Gogol's Taras Bulba at the execution of his son, Ostap, who shouted into the crowd, "Father, where are you? Do you hear me?" before he was put to death. Hrihori refused to leave the premises and waited until his son had taken a shower. Petro was obviously sick. As he recalled later, "I started to feel bad in the shower. I came out. My father was waiting for me. 'How do you feel, sonny?' Hearing almost nothing by then, I heard only, 'Hold on.'" In the dorm room above the garage of Fire Department No. 6 in Pripyat, Lyudmila Inatenko could not sleep after her husband, Vasil, left for the plant before 2 a.m. She was pregnant with their first child, whose birth was expected soon, but it was more than that. She felt that something was wrong. The fire truck was not coming back. 4 o'clock, 5, 6, she recalled. At 6 we were supposed to go to his parents' home to plant potatoes. Not until 7 did Lyudmila learn that Vasil was not coming back. He was in the hospital. She rushed there but could not get through. The police had cordoned it off, allowing only ambulances to go back and forth at great speed. They ordered people to stay away from the ambulances. Lyudmila was desperate. She found a doctor whom she knew. "I grabbed her white coat when she came out of the ambulance. 'Get me inside.' 'I can't. He's bad. They all are.' Lyudmila begged, and the doctor finally agreed. He was all swollen and puffed up, recalled Lyudmila. She could hardly see Vasil's eyes. Lyudmila asked her husband what she could do to help him. "Get out of here. Go. You have our child," he said weakly. "Go. Leave. Save the baby." Lyudmila remembered the doctors telling Vasil and others that they had gas poisoning, but he probably knew that it was radiation. That realization came too late to Vasil and his fellow firefighters, but once they understood what was happening, they wanted their families out. They had extinguished the fire, but they could do nothing about the radiation. It was out of control and only starting its destruction of their bodies and the environment. Volodymyr Pravik's parents waited in vain for hours for their son to come and help them with the gardening. When they finally learned that he was in the Pripyat hospital, they rushed to see him. Volodymyr told them through the window to get on their motorcycle, grab his wife Nadika and daughter Natalka, wrap Natalka in as many blankets as possible, and send both immediately to Nadika's parents in central Ukraine, away from Pripyat and Chernobyl. They did as he said. Before leaving their apartment, Nadika left a letter for Volodymyr on the table, telling him where she and Natalka were. Their romance had been conducted largely by letter. This would be the only one to remain unanswered.